Awesome. So, Elliot, thank you for being with us. You are the founder of Human Nature and Human Nature Projects, an environmental impact initiative leading local sustainability and wildlife conservation projects across 100 countries through a powerful network of volunteers. That's a very exciting and ambitious project you're currently you're running, and we'd love to hear and learn more about that. So thank you for being here, Elliot, and over to you.
Being the founder of Human Nature makes me God, technically, so I'm not quite sure about that, but yes, I founded and run this organisation, Human Nature Projects. But what I would like to do is actually start with a story. So this story takes place almost a decade ago now. I was 10 years old at the time, camped with a group of friends and family in the north of Botswana, so southern Africa. No fences on the campground, all the animals are wandering through. And I was on a nighttime trip to the toilet block at the far end of the campground, walking slowly back to the fire circle, just appreciating the nightlife, hearing the sounds of the crickets, the night owls hooting, all the millions of stars you can see out somewhere that remote. And just as I reached the edge of this circle of glowing light, which is this roaring fire at the time, I had what was almost a sixth sense. So I turned around, and there behind me, barely 2 meters away, was a leopard crouched, stalking low to the ground. So, with the due understatement that accompanies such life and death situations, I said, I think there's something behind me. That was my famous line. And I had a few people were sitting around the fire. One of them turned on a flashlight, lit up this leopard full in the beam. Thankfully, leopards are ambush predators. So from that point onwards, I was safe, so to speak. But I still locked eyes with that leopard for a good 3-5 seconds, and held that. It is a night I can remember very, very vividly all this time later. Of course, we all retired very rapidly to the tents, slept not so soundly for that night, and the next morning there was an official notice. The authorities caught wind of this. There was large panic on all the forward drive forums, all the local campsite message boards, and unfortunately that leopard was almost certainly shot. As a result of this, it's not that leopard's fault. It's completely the fault of the humans and the campground managers specifically. What we suspect is that leopard had been fed by prior campers, fed sausages, fed mince, beans, whatever, and therefore had grown accustomed to associating humans with food, which is a very dangerous situation. So it had become a risk to campers, and unfortunately leopards being so territorial, relocating was by far the more challenging option, so that leopard lost its life due to a fault in our human relationship with nature, because we don't treat animals as worthy equals, as being owed respect, appreciation, and that's very sad. So if you fast forward to about 3 years ago now, I was in the south of France in midwinter, lodging in a 13th century castle. At the time, I was rescuing raptors, eagles, vultures, hawks, and such, caring for them in these huge Jurassic Park hangars, big grey buildings. But in the long winter evenings, I was puzzling over this question. So how could we address this fault in our human relationship with nature? How could we bring community into wildlife conservation work? Because for many, many years prior to that in Australia, where I grew up, I'm now in the UK, but over in Australia, I had been trying to volunteer in environmental circles, make a difference locally on these sorts of issues, and found tremendous pushback, being at the time a minor, being passionate but largely unskilled, uneducated, and therefore low value as a volunteer for making a difference on such courses. So I had found it tremendously difficult and was looking for a solution to remedy that. I researched the operations of 200 of the largest environmental NGOs, mapped out all the different ways they're operating, their use of volunteers, their funding sources, their global scope, geographical range, all that jazz. And out of that extensive process arose this idea for human nature projects, and it was deceptively simple. I had no intention whatsoever, frankly, of starting a global NGO. I was looking to create a community of like-minded persons to create a global network, an informal but impactful space to give rise to projects which could remedy this human-nature relationship. It didn't turn out that way. It turned out much larger than I had expected, could have hoped for, dreamed of, and any of that. Within 2 months, we had volunteers across 100 countries, and through blood, sweat, and tears, and many 2 a.m. webinars, we did get this show off the road. So how it's running is very, very simply, we have a passionate, dedicated lead assigned or often stepping forward in each country, taking up the mantle, performing all the local community outreach, building up a national team. So passionate people who come from all walks of life, genuinely, all ages, all backgrounds, all professions, and who want to make a difference. Simple as that. And because they are locally run, locally organised, locally sourced, that they do have the knowledge of where to address the issues at that community's scale and how best to go about doing so. In the Republic of the Congo, they'll be looking at chimpanzees and gorillas and the human interactions with great apes, which unfortunately aren't always brilliant. So they're working with the sanctuaries there. They're doing education, going into schools, working with all the local leaders to make sure there are workflows set up for if there is a conflict, especially with farmers and the likes, that will mean the animals in question get a fair treatment, and the human nature projects can step in, relocate them, save them if necessary. But making sure we do address those issues. In Canada, on the other side of the world, they do a lot of industry work, working with fishing and overfishing, specifically unsustainable fishing practices, to make sure that the industry is held accountable for that. But really going groundswell on this, because that is what environmentalism is as a movement. If you look back 100 years, almost when it started, it was entirely run by local communities formed from structures like this. So all the national teams take on a particular character, which is most effective at addressing the local issues they face. And then we support them financially, logistically, technically, on a global scale. I speak with them on a weekly basis about their projects, draw the links between respective national teams, and coordinate 10 international working groups, which are formed on a skills or an ideas basis. So we have an education working group, which is forming school clubs, developing resources for them, translating them into half a dozen languages. We have filmmaking working groups looking at creative campaigning communications. So yeah, these different sorts of approaches to the issue, but all completely organic in terms of how it's organized and how it continues to operate, which is honestly a blessing for me, because I couldn't run it otherwise or in any other way. It would be unfeasible, to say the least. The latest project we have in the works, which is relevant to this forum as well, is taking a slightly different approach. It's called the Nature Nexus, and it is capitalizing on the Human Nature Project network, this existing infrastructure that we have in place. And we're training, developing what we hope will be about 200 mostly young naturalist filmmakers who will then be contracted to go out and film local animal characters for 3 hours each day, which will then be conglomerated into a 24/7 live stream of nature globally. And to that, expert field guides providing studio commentary, an interactive platform format which would allow viewers to ask questions to be answered in real time, much like sort of radio does. And there have been attempts towards this, but nothing of this scale thus far. So the Nature Nexus is the next big thing that Human Nature Projects has in the works. And yeah, I mean, with that background, I'm realizing the time constraints we have. I'd love to open it up to any questions you might have, and a bit of a crowdsourced discussion that I'm sure we can get going on. But yeah, I mean, Human Nature Project, the Nature Nexus is where I'm coming from. And you can imagine the problems we face. Mostly funding, so in terms of acquiring the necessary resources, the Nature Nexus especially has been crippled by that since COVID. And with Human Nature Project, it's about obviously the logistical constraints of the international organizing side of things, especially making sure that's effective, fast, reliable, and all that jazz. So yeah, any questions, comments, feedback, ideas?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing your project with us, Elliot, and your passion. There was something that you touched on that I found interesting, an interesting discussion point, which was in the case of was a leopard, wasn't it? That anecdote when you were a boy, that the life of the leopard wasn't seen as valuable as a life of a human being. So we might call that a speciesist quality.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wondered if you would touch on that. I mean, many people would argue, well, yes, the life of a human being is worth more than the life of a lion or a leopard, or, and then the question is, where do you draw the line? And so I'm just interested in your point of view on that.
Of course. And it's an incredibly difficult question to answer. So I wrote a book about this, published it at the start of the year. That's 300 pages of an answer to that question. But in terms of a 1 minute answer, it comes down to not necessarily evaluating the respective rights to life of humans and other animals, but making sure in our interactions with them, we do treat them with respect, compassion, dignity, all of those things which can very, very easily, honestly, be achieved in at least 95% of these situations. There is absolutely no conflict of interest that needs to take place. I'll give you another example. So earlier this year, I spent 2 months up on the Great Barrier Reef doing some filming, science communication work, all that stuff. And there they have a very strange ecological process, which is the Pisonia tree. So the Pisonia tree has a sticky uh, sort of seed, I guess, one would call them, and those can entangle some of the young birds. There are 100,000 noddies, a bit like terns or seagulls, if your biology isn't great, nesting on those Great Barrier Reef islands. So these young noddy birds often get tangled up in the Pisonia seeds, and they fall to the ground and ultimately starve or are trampled by tourists underfoot, or are killed by any of the predators on the island, which is absolutely awful to see. They've also got turtles nesting on the beaches there, which wander inland, as you can imagine. And if you walk around these islands and read the signs, all of them say, don't touch the young noddy birds, leave them to die. Or don't touch the turtles, leave them to die. Not in those words, but it is telling these tourists, these compassionate human beings, that they cannot interfere, that they cannot save this hatchling turtle which has accidentally wandered inland under their house, or that they can't save this young noddy bird which is being left to starve on the ground. That the last time we humans did that was in the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, when you left the runt of the litter, of the human litter, out on the mountains to die. So it's these sorts of situations which absolutely needn't arise. There are far better solutions which take the smallest amount of community intervention or innovation to rectify. So hopefully that answers your question to some extent.
Well, it does. It does beg the question. It does beg the question: what is the role of human beings in our interactions with the wildness of nature? Is our role simply to stay out of the way? Because in that case example, the role was to stay out of the way. Is our role to stay out of the way? I mean, certainly we do a terrible job of it in terms of destruction of habitat and so on. But what would you prescribe as the role of human beings in our relationship with nature?
Yeah. So if you look at it from an ecological perspective, human beings have two characteristics. And again, I talk about this in detail in all my writings. But we are opportunists, and many animals, likewise pigeons, rats, ibises in Australia, have done brilliantly as opportunists, raccoons in the Americas, pick your example, foxes in the UK. All of these are opportunists. They make the most of fragmented, damaged, new habitats, which is why we have thrived in cities, which is why all these animals we see doing just as well in urban environments, because we're opportunists. Second characteristic we hold is as ecosystem engineers. Another example you might get from nature is beavers. Very famously, the Yellowstone National Park, we had that entire rundown effect when they removed the wolves, which meant eventually they had fewer beavers, which meant the rivers ran straight, which meant entire ecosystems along those the previously winding rivers were obliterated. So the beavers built dams, they changed the ecosystem around them physically, literally. They shift these ecosystems, and humans are ecosystem engineers in the same way. We build new habitats, ecosystems, these cities, shoddy ecosystems that they are, but they are ecosystems in which we thrive. So we're ecosystem engineers and we're opportunists, and no other animals hold those two traits in combination. So anything else, intelligence, adaptability, tool use, animals ultimately share to greater or lesser extents. But those two traits make humans unique. And if you then translate that to our interactions with nature, it forms a really interesting perspective. Because obviously those two traits are not inherently damaging to nature, that they're not necessarily going to detriment other animals' prospects. It depends on how they're used. So, I mean, I told you the Human Nature Projects works in wildlife conservation, but it's not conservation at all, because we're not trying to conserve nature as it is. We're trying to restore it. We're trying to create a productive co-relationship with nature, with animals. So the word choice is impossible in this line of work because conservation is what it's called. It's not conservation at all. But what we are trying to do is absolutely not take our hands off of nature, step back, leave it be. There are great ways in which humans can coexist with nature. All the studies show that the world over, there are greater biodiversity of, for example, bird species in farmed lands or in patchy environments. Well, Australia has examples of it as well. You have the valleys in the southeast of Australia, which have patches of farms interspersed with woodlands, forming world-class birding spots and ecological preserves. So those are by no means untouched by human hand, but they are used productively in such a manner that humans and animals and nature get the best of both worlds. So yeah, again, hopefully that answers your question in the limited time we have available.
I was very pleased to see that Akasha, our friend on this call, just said that that they bought your book, Human Nature: How Better Animals.
There you go. That's the one.
Yeah, yeah, how wonderful. Maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about that that publication.
Yeah, it was a lockdown project. If you can think back to last year, with all the COVID shenanigans going on, but it was a work of love from ideas over many years, founding Human Nature Projects, and all that, and addressing very specifically the question you asked just now about how humans differ from other animals and how that affects our relationship with them. Whether we do need to take our hands off nature, leave them be, or whether, as I've just started arguing, uh, we can work with animals to form more productive solutions. And I gave a TED talk on this year before publishing the book, which is where actually I started writing down many of these ideas in terms of how we work with nature as opposed to against it or apart from it. But yeah, fascinating. The way even that conversation has shifted over the past decade, 2 decades. So we're doing new research into animal communication intelligence. We're coming quite close actually to be able to speak with animals in their own languages. The Earth Species Project, if you want to look it up, incredible, mind-blowing science using AI, mapping languages in hundreds of dimensions. If you can imagine what that looks like, I can't. But hundreds of dimensional maps of languages and then corroborating them like jigsaws to fit them together so we can talk to animals, create means of working alongside them. And yeah, I mean, even without that communication boundary being breached, we're already doing this in hundreds of ways. So incredible to see the way conservation has changed just over the past 10, 20 years from what it was 70, 80 years ago. It's evolving as it should.
So where would you see the future of, I mean, this word conservation is an interesting one. There's conservation, there's regeneration of habitats, regeneration of species, regeneration of our planet, regeneration of our rivers, regeneration of our oceans. You know, where do you see, in terms of what's happening right now, where is the trend? Is there a positive trend in the preservation and restoration of the wilds, or quite the opposite, or a bit of both? What are you seeing?
There are positive trends. Overwhelmingly, they are positive trends that we see. They're just not fast enough positive trends. That they're not rapid as or as rapid as we'd like to see. So, I mean, highly recommend that you read Factfulness by Hans Rosling if you haven't already. That talks about the world getting better, but doing so at varying rates. And this is what we see with in wildlife conservation, especially. So we just had the COI COP conferences on climate change, climate mitigation up in Glasgow. I was up there talking with everyone, addressing these issues, which are very closely linked to conservation itself. But I mean, just as with climate change, we're seeing slow, gradual progress, which isn't meeting the thresholds of change that we'd like to see. So it is in wildlife conservation. So there are great things happening, but there isn't the funding, the resources there to make large scale change happen. One of the pet projects I love to talk about is called Nature Needs Half, or the Half Earth Project. And that is backed by a world-leading biologist, very famous, E.O. Wilson, who did this research about 30 years ago, which showed that if we set aside, no, we allow cohabitation with humans and animals for 50% of Earth's lands and oceans, then we prevent the extinction of 85% of living species. So that is a very well documented fact that if we set aside 50% of our lands and oceans in these key strategic areas, which have been very clearly mapped out. You can see it. This 3D interactive map you can pull up on the web that shows where humans are, where animals are, and where we can share those spaces with them in a productive manner. But currently it's about 15% of our lands hold any sort of protection. It's about 7-8% of our oceans. Most people think it's about 30% of each. So National Geographic studied this a few years back. People vastly overestimate what we are doing as a start to protect nature, and that's one of the key barriers we have to overcome. I did a survey called the Eco IQ quiz 2 years ago, so just as COVID was emerging. Funny the way timelines have changed, but yeah, that was really simple 12-question multiple choice survey, and people did worse in random chance at answering basic questions about the state of our planet. So they could have guessed it and done better on average, which is a real shame, because it shows that we really do have the goodwill. We have the desire to change our Earth, our interactions with our planet in a positive manner, but we sincerely believe we are already doing so to a far greater extent than we are. So there's obviously natural apathy to overcome, but yes, it's the education boundary and the finance boundary that Human Nature Projects is working on.
Thank you, Elliot. Terrific points there. I want to very quickly announce our next speaker before, and then I'll go to Heidi's last question, if Heidi, you could stand by. But our next speaker, Julius, and I'd really encourage everybody on this call to stay on this call, because he's going to give us a 101 introduction to blockchain technology and how this technology works. And then he's going to go on to introduce the initiative that he's developed that enables people to stake their crypto for projects for good. So, and he'll explain what that means precisely, but it's really quite groundbreaking and very relevant for everyone on this call. So, Heidi, if you would like to unmute yourself, because we'd love to hear your question if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. Okay, so my question is, and this is something I've thought about a lot. So I've been researching a book, which I just talked about before, based in Southeast Asia's oldest zoo. Now, this zoo sits in the middle of the longest running civil war in modern history. So the zoo has not been updated in probably, since like nearly 80 years, since World War II. So you have all these animals who are living in terrible conditions in an ongoing war zone. And a lot of these people are in a lot of poverty, people surrounding the zoo, very low awareness of just well-being in general, let alone well-being of an animal. When my book comes out, one of the things that will happen is that there will be a lot of awareness that comes around the zoo, and I'm hoping that it will bring about a lot of protest about the zoo, because it's the oldest zoo in Southeast Asia, and it's the most inhumane, like horrific prison for animals, a torture site for animals, really. And I'm not the only person saying that. But what are the answers when you have animals that have only ever lived in captivity, especially if you're talking about animals like tigers and leopards and lions, which are in the zoo? Like, what are you going to do? I mean, those animals specifically, there's probably some reserves that they could go to, but in general, what's your perspective on something like that? If you can also have this idea, wouldn't it be nice to shut down the zoo? Then what do you do with animals?
That's a great question. Yeah. And to clarify for everyone who's listening in, the dilemma you face is, as you state, these animals have been raised in captivity. They're unaware, essentially, of life in the wild, how they would then survive. This is an issue all these establishments face. There's a great story, if you want to look it up, of a zoo in the Netherlands, I believe, which had a climbing infrastructure frame added to their orangutan exhibit, and all the orangutans, having not been raised in such surrounds, had forgotten how to swing around the trees, how to climb. They brought an Olympic gymnast in to teach them. It's a really difficult circumstance, because ultimately what I would advise is actually working with the zoo, with the local communities, to obviously educate them about the circumstances that these animals are in, the horrific conditions you've mentioned, which they're subject to, but then changing the zoo to make it better for them, because you then can't release those animals out into the wild. There's almost zero chance of those animals surviving if you were then to grant them freedom. There are limited animal sanctuaries out there. I don't know what the state is in around this zoo, whether there would be such an establishment, but sanctuaries, great places where often the animals of zoos, establishments, circuses, which is shut down, can then go. It's still a captive environment. It's not wild by any case, but it's without so much cages and bars and all that. But yeah, ultimately, so I volunteer as a wildlife rescuer, and we face these terrible cases of animals which we know will never be able to release out in the wild. So then legally, you have to euthanize them, which is horrific, absolute ruins any day you can imagine. And it's a funny old world, because one of the big issues we face is actually drawing the line between the natural and the unnatural. There's a disease called beak and feather, which affects most of the parrots, the lorikeets, the cockatoos, and basically stunts them, means they can't fly. They're called runners because they have to run along the ground. They can't gain any height. And naturally they'd be picked off by predators. But when we take them into captivity, then again, officially, we would be asked to euthanize them. It's contagious, so it could theoretically spread to other animals that we might take in. But it's something like a 10-20% chance that they recover over an 18-month span. So, I mean, even then, they're not dead. They couldn't be written off. They could recover. But because of the limitations we face, which are somewhat legal, somewhat logistical, we can't give them that due respect, dignity, care and attention that we'd like to. So it's an imperfect system we're working with. But yeah, it's always about doing the best. So improving that zoo where possible, or releasing those animals into a sanctuary. And I'll shut up, Brett, so you can introduce the next speaker.
Yes, it's a very complex session. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, Elliot. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your journey. And really, we wish you all the best. And we look forward to having a deeper conversation about how we can potentially support your project and how tokenization may be able to help.